Hello friends, for today's video we're back with another From Readers, specifically 2 writers from Readers villains, and the prompt asks the question, what makes a villain compelling? If a villain leans into pure evil territory, what makes that work and what makes it fail? Do you prefer villains you love to hate, or ones with motives you connect with and maybe even root for? Before we get into the responses, a couple of things. First off, if you are a Cosmere fan, over on my collaborative channel World Hoppers, myself and some of my friends here on BookTube got together and did a tier ranking of a lot of the villains across the Cosmere, and I think a lot of what we're going to touch on today is likely we take that and then you can actually see it wrestled with and debated in that video, as there are a lot of different kinds of villains across the Cosmere, and I think a lot of the times the questions that we had while we were trying to decide what makes a good villain and what makes a bad villain is how successful they are, how much they actually oppose our heroes. Do we actually love them because we don't hate them, but somehow they're really successful at their plans and their plans are ultimately not for the greater good? There's just a lot of things that came up within that made the tier ranking, I think, actually kind of difficult. By the way, also, I just want to state, yes, indeed, a certain character did do something wrong. That video will be linked. As always, the videos over on that channel, all the AdSense revenue and merch sales goes to charity, so definitely check it out. There's a lot of other topics that are discussed over there. Second, as always, I will be reading through my Patreon responses, and then we'll jump over to the responses from the community tab. If you ever want to guarantee that your response gets read, I do always ensure that I go through Patreon responses, as it is because of my patrons and their continued support that I can do this for a job. I actually, for anybody that's really nosy, did have an entire breakdown and post over on Patreon going through how much I make, because I just wanted to be really transparent with my patrons, since they are individuals that are supporting me on the financial end of things. And if you are curious about that breakdown, spoiler alert, I make about minimum wage. Anyway, we're here to talk about bad guys. Jumping into the responses, Jamie says, the best way to make a villain work is to show how they justify their actions. Everyone believes themselves to be doing the right thing or above the rules. Our brains are great at ignoring the bad things we do, after all. A pure evil villain can also work, but I think keeping their motives a mystery works better for that. I find that this is a key component. A lot of times, some of my favorite stories are the ones where there's a very big range of what makes a character good and what makes a character bad, and even the good characters have their flawed moments, and the bad characters as well. A story that I come back to frequently when I talk about that full range, apologies, but Full Metal Alchemist and Oldie Buddy Goodie. And I also think something more recent that I've been talking about a lot would be Attack on Titan. Sorry that they're both manga anime references. There are, of course, other stories that do this really phenomenally, but Full Metal in particular, I have often pointed to as having a great range, as you do see the way in which certain characters are a part of a society that, when you look at the past, that society's progress in a lot of ways was rooted in their oppression and destruction of an entire other civilization, and the way in which that then causes certain characters to have this, you could argue, justifiable hatred for this entire civilization and everything that was taken from them as a result of this group. And I don't want to say the character's name because I don't want to spoil it if you've never checked out Full Metal, but this character does take some very strong steps in the direction of revenge and trying to find purpose again. Some of these steps do result in them not just opposing the people that were partially present or full-on responsible for some of the atrocities that were committed during war, but some of the people they end up going up against are now some of our heroes that had nothing to do with that situation and the conflict, but you also can see why they would get to a point where they would be sort of blinded by hatred. So initially, some of our characters, they view that person as an antagonist, but the more you get to understand that person, the more you recognize in them why they have the motivations they do. And I think part of why Full Metal is great is it's not just you realizing that, it's also some of the other characters. And then, while that character, I think, sometimes I don't even know that people call them a villain. I think some people just consider them to have some grayness surrounding them. But then you have characters that pretty much represent forces of destruction, and to have that full range is fantastic. And I do want to note that our protagonists often have times where they engage in activity that isn't necessarily pure in its entirety. So I do think that Full Metal captures a lot of that extremely well. Next up, Caitlin says, I prefer villains with a motive rather than they're just evil, but I also don't want authors to stray into the territory of excusing the villain's behavior because of their past. An explanation is not an excuse. To me, what makes a villain the most compelling to read is when they are insidious in their villainy, when their actions slowly start creeping into the villainous territory, sometimes right before the reader's eyes. If a villain is going to be pure evil, I think that works better in a comedic satirical setting. I think that it's easy to make them the mustache-twirling cartoonish villain when they're pure evil. I'll go through your response in order. So the first idea of wanting there to be an explanation, but also not wanting that to feel like an excuse. This can be really difficult if you're trying to show the ways in which, let's say, the villain of the story is somebody who is abusive. And so thus it's more of a, maybe like more of a domestic setting as opposed to really epic proportions where they're representing these forces. It's more personal. I think a lot of times the person who is experiencing the abuse, they themselves will engage in justifying the actions of the person because they do care about them, and so they find reasons to turn the explanation into an excuse. And this in and of itself could be a whole discussion, but I do think that it's important for authors to be honest with how, to use your word, insidious abuse can be, and to help explain to people who've not experienced it or who don't understand why maybe they themselves were responding the way they were when they were experiencing abuse, sometimes to actually see an honest portrayal of that. I think that can be really moving. However, it can be very easy to interpret as we're trying to, as the author, like as if the author themselves is trying to excuse the behavior and say like, no, but also they had a tragic past, so it's fine that they are now being horrible to this person they supposedly care about. I don't think a lot of authors' intentions are to try and do that. I think a lot of authors want to portray that in a way that is true. I do think it's important for readers to ask the tough question and to really engage with any kind of art that portrays these sorts of situations, to ask themselves, am I uncomfortable with this material because I genuinely feel like the author is trying to say, hey, it's totally fine for someone to be abusive, or am I uncomfortable with it because I have to confront the ways in which our minds can almost play tricks on us when we are in these scenarios, that this can happen to anybody, and it is an honest portrayal of it, but that it makes me uncomfortable to even think about. I think that we have to be mindful of not immediately dismissing an honest portrayal of that sort of situation just because it feels uncomfortable. But I do agree that there are instances where it does feel like it's not just an honest portrayal, and it feels like we are trying to say like, well, it's fine that they did this terrible thing because they've experienced something sad. And this, I also think, is a push and pull that authors who are really gifted at writing villains and writing gray morality, this is something that you often get when you have a multiple perspective story, especially when you have groups of people. I kind of touched on this in the previous example, but when you have groups of people who have been mistreated and oppressed, and they're trying to push back against that because they ultimately are fighting for the greater good, but then there are those moral conundrums that come up of, at what cost do we get the greater good? And then also you see this in a lot of revenge stories where a character initially might set out to get justice, and I think we view the word justice in a certain way, whereas we view the word revenge as something that maybe is more all-consuming, whereas justice is this pure intentioned thing to pursue. When you have characters convincing themselves like, no, I'm just trying to get justice, and then they continuously disregard people and hurt people, harm people that are around them, and they start engaging in more and more villainous behavior to the point where they maybe then start to become the villain, that's when you can actually see really well done revenge stories, and you actually are wanting to root for the character, but then you're like, oh, I don't know if I can root for you anymore. There's another side of all of this that I don't love, which is that I do feel like part of what comes into the picture as far as how often readers and fandoms view a character as a villain is how hot they perceive the character. So the idea of this character's actions, it's great to have an explanation, but an explanation isn't an excuse. I do feel like if the character is hot, then sometimes readers will be like, no, but also justice for this character, or they deserved better. And you're like, I mean, didn't they though? I understand there's certain works of fiction where we are doing interesting and sometimes even satirical things with villains, and maybe we are having commentary on the way that society can make excuses for people they find attractive. You know, maybe there's something that the author is doing with that concept, but I do think sometimes we have built into a lot of what's popular right now the idea of deciding that horrible behavior is fine because the character is somebody that we like to imagine ourselves with. I do think there are intentions behind certain authors writing it in a way where they're basically giving that to you on a platter, where they're like, here you go, I know some of you are into this and I'm going to deliver. That's not quite the same thing as characters that are written in a nuanced way. Authors doing what they can to show, okay, here's all the reasons that our characters feel bad for them. Here's all the reasons that maybe you as a reader might feel bad for them. But that doesn't excuse it. And then I think sometimes people forget but that doesn't excuse it. And they're just like, oh, but they're hot and misunderstood. And if that doesn't sum up the bad boy arc, I feel like that we get, and we've gotten this before. I feel like we get it now. It's been around. It's not as edgy and new, I feel like, as people think it is. It's just, I think we just keep pushing the boundaries of what we excuse from the misunderstood bad boy. Man, this could launch into a whole conversation, but the point is that I agree with you that it's great when you have an explanation, but we don't want to frame that as excuses. And then also, I didn't touch on this very much, but I agree, I kind of went into it when talking about the revenge versus justice kinds of plot lines where you see it sort of building up in them over time. And then for the mustache twirling villainous character, I agree that I like it and satirical. Like, they're so ridiculous and over the top. Also, what makes that kind of character work is when they have the freedom to behave like that because of random institutions or certain amounts of wealth that not only uplift them, but protect them so that there's never a reason for them to pay the price for their actions, and there are no consequences. There's nothing to answer to because they have this bubble that protects them from everything. And I think a lot of people can find that really actually satisfying to read because so often we in our day-to-day lives face consequences, or if we take certain actions, we'll face consequences. But we see other people who don't, and we sort of rage against the unfairness of it all, and it can really affect us. There are instances where you see those other people and you're like, it's so frustrating that they never have to deal with this. And so sometimes seeing that kind of a character in a story, even though maybe they don't have the most heartbreaking of reasons why they're doing what they're doing, is that they're just awful. You're like, yeah, I mean, those people, there are reasons why sometimes people get away with horrible things. Anyway, moving on now. Next up, I think there's a time and a place for both types of villains. Probably the best example of this I've seen discussed is the difference between Sauron and Gollum. Based strictly off the original book, Sauron is a being of pure evil who's constantly a looming threat in the background from which most of the major conflicts derive. Gollum is inherently one or the other. He's constantly toying the line between good and evil. The pure evil beings give our heroes something to focus their energy on, and we can always trust that they will be justified in fighting against the evil. The morally gray villains, on the other hand, give our heroes a different kind of obstacle, and this conflict usually sees the character grow in some way throughout the story. I don't think we always need both represented in a story, but I do think that having both is probably one of the best possible combinations. Having only pure evil doesn't leave us much room to guess, and having only morally gray has us guessing too much. However, I do think that morally gray villains are easier to do as the only villain in a story versus the other way around, and in many cases this does work quite well. And then there was a response to this. So that first thing was mentioned by Andrew. And then this next one is Friend Owl Design. This, I can't agree more. I think there's room for a range of villains in many works. I like seeing villains and antagonists juxtaposed. That's probably why the political intrigue slice of fantasy got to be so popular. People love seeing different shades of bad interaction, whether it's bad on bad or versus good. Whether it's a standalone or an epic series, there's room for multiple types of villains to pull out and examine the different types of humanity that we don't see daily. Others have stated loving a villain's purpose, but I think seeing them deal with choices in a morally mixed cast is what makes me remember any of my favorite bad guys. Even as someone tired of the morally gray, everyone is imperfect, no one is good trend, I still love what a juxtaposition brings. Heroes aren't the only ones needing a good foil. I agree so much with what was stated. I do want to expand on the idea of how a good range of villains can develop the main characters. I think what you were stating is that when you have just that pure evil character, the reason it's boring isn't just because there's not a lot to the villain, but because the characters naturally are always going to look, generally speaking, good when they're going up against something bad. It's not even just a matter of like everybody's actually really great. It's that you don't even get to explore people as people. You just see one force against another force, and one of them happens to be in a human-like shape, but that doesn't really explore them as characters very well or in a very interesting way. Whereas when you have just the morally gray versus our main characters, the idea that it then builds into us too much of like, well, who am I supposed to root for? Which I will admit, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I kind of like when everybody sees themselves as doing right and good, but because people have different perceptions of what that is, it creates conflict. I think that can be really interesting. I just think that it then no longer feels like you really have a villain, which is okay. Not every book needs to have, this is the bad guy, but it also results in us oftentimes not having something or someone to totally hate, unless, when I think this actually can be done well, you have a character that perceives what they're doing as good. And maybe outwardly they don't look like pure evil, but they feel like a real person that grates and gets under your skin and fails to recognize why so many things go wrong and like, how is this always happening? And you're like, you idiot. And you get so frustrated at them because they don't recognize how they fit into that at all. And I think a great example of a character like this, apologies that I keep pulling from things that aren't books, but Jace from Arcane, I think that, a perfect way to capture this is that I saw this, I guess, meme where someone was like, everybody seems to hate Jace, and at this point I'm too afraid to ask why. And I think that just goes to show, because Jace, if you don't know and you're unfamiliar with Arcane, Jace is a very pure intentioned character. They are not even close to being a pure evil, or even really like morally gray in the way I think a lot of us think of morally gray these days, because nowadays morally gray is like, well, this character, they beat up people who abuse women, but also they murder people who get on their nerves. So like sometimes they're cool and good, and other times like you're like, well, maybe don't murder somebody, you know. And that's a really bad example, but you know what I'm saying. Like it's like sometimes in certain areas they're good, and then in other areas they're bad, and it still results in it feeling superficial. Anyway, with Jace, this character is well intentioned, and he doesn't have evil reasons for why he's doing what he's doing. His goal isn't to set out and get rich. His goal isn't like, I'm going to try to take from those who have less than me. That's not his situation at all. He consistently, and it's so aggravating, but whatever's right in front of him and whoever's talking to him, he's like, you're totally right. And he feels strongly for whatever is being discussed in that moment. And then he takes actions as a result, and then someone else will be like, what are you doing? You can't do this because of this, this, and this. And the list of reasons, he's like, you're right. I should have never done this. And then he goes against what he was doing before, and then someone else will come into the picture, and it's the same thing over and over again. And he just is like, I'm done with this. And the frustration of that character is that he is in a position where he can walk away from problems if he so chooses, because he does have some amount of luxury and privilege that other characters in the story, sometimes they're kids, they don't have that same thing. They don't get to walk away. And so you're just like, dude, either commit or stop. And also think for a second. And he's like really bad. It's just, he's so well done. But like, is that a villain? You know, that's the whole idea of if you have a lot of characters who aren't necessarily just pure evil and you just have like, I'm trying to do the right thing. It can be kind of confusing, and I think it also results in a lot of debate between people who are engaging with the story, because then there are some people that are like, yeah, but they're doing their best, which is different from this other character, and you're like, well, I mean, but they're also causing more problems, and just because you have good intentions doesn't mean that your actions don't result in bad things occurring. So I think that that's really well done. However, I think, as you have stated, when you have a combination of morally gray characters and the pretty much just pure evil, you have that long-term goal that the characters are working against, but it's through the morally gray characters that a lot of the more introspection happens and a lot of the great character growth can occur. And I will say it does present for opportunities for characters that used to hate each other to come together to go up against the ultimate evil, which is kind of fun. I also will add, sorry, this is so much to this one point, that I also think that something interesting that can occur that is really frustrating to watch, but it's so well representing what can occur in real life, which is that there is this ultimate evil that everybody should be focusing on, but they get so caught up in going up against the morally gray character or force that the ultimate evil continues to basically win because we're too caught up with the petty things or the less significant things. So I think that can be done exceptionally well. Also, Andrew, you expanded, you also wanted to add, another thing I just thought of is that villains don't always have to be an external singular entity. Frozen 2 comes to mind as the first example of this. I've not seen Frozen 2, but I'll believe you. Say what you want about the Frozen movies, but the concept of giving an internal villain some form of external being was a really intriguing concept. Internal conflict is often poised as one of the most important types of conflicts for protagonists to overcome during their character arcs. Both Frozen movies essentially did this, but the second movie and Elsa's arc specifically took a twist on this internal conflict and made it seem external for the majority of the story. And then they also have conflict in the fact that everyone had the wrong idea about the world and the others in it. There was no specific villain, it was simply these concepts and misunderstandings that drove the main conflict. It just goes to show that there are so many creative ways for conflict and the villains who embody it to play out. The idea of making something internal more of the focus as far as what is fulfilling the villain role, I think is also something that can go across various different age ranges and genres. But because you're talking about Frozen 2 in this specific example, I actually really like the idea of this being explored in a story that is technically the target demographic is younger people. I always feel like clarifying, even though I don't probably need to, that just because the target demographic is younger people doesn't mean that it somehow can't still be applied to older audiences. But specifically, when you're younger, you are going through different things than oftentimes adults are. And while this is a concept that is applicable no matter your age, I do think something about growing up that helps indicate a level of how to process your emotions is this grappling with, why do I feel the way I feel? Why is it that this person, I got angry when they said this to me, even though I don't think they meant to make me angry, and how do I deal with that? Or they're going through a lot of stress right now, and that stress is causing them to feel a lot of pain, or it's causing them to kind of close up and withdraw from the things that typically they find enjoyment from, and then learning how to look inward at those things and face them head on, I think is really powerful. Of course, again, this is something you can do at any age, but I do think it seems like something that is more abstract and complicated and that wouldn't really translate well to something for younger people, but because it is something we should all work at doing consistently throughout our lives, I think having it start at a younger age, it just allows for people to learn how to do that for themselves. And it can kind of be a teaching moment, as cheesy as that sounds. Sorry, I feel like this got a little annoying, but I just really like that concept. And I do think oftentimes when something is internal, it can cause us to see villains outwardly, and it's not until we look internally that we realize, like, oh no, the problem is me. Not always. There's different ways to portray internal conflict as villainous, but I do think that's part of the brilliance of it, is that there are so many things you can do with it. Next up, the trouble is pure evil villains essentially have to be purpose-built and architected in place to work properly and be sold widely. It's been done successfully many times, but it's difficult nonetheless. What do our classic Dark Lords have in common between genres? Well, overwhelming power that allows them to act with impunity, with zero meaningful reprisal. This is kind of what I was touching on before. Questioning or pushback possible by anyone around them. Functionally infinite resources, including both currency reserves and manpower or slave labor, and an unquenchable thirst for control over other people's lives and actions. Yeah, I think that touched on a lot of what we discussed before as to what makes that sometimes work. The ways in which I think this can become frustrating and not work, frustrating from a viewpoint of like, okay, but this is kind of stupid, is if anybody at any time has a very easy way of dismantling this power that this person has, or anybody can oppose them, the people that want to oppose them, if they're just like not doing anything and it all turns into convenience, I think that's when it's not written well. But as is stated here, and then kind of what we touched on before, when there are things in place that allow them to continue to hold this level of power, that's when I think it becomes actually well done. And it also gets to us understanding how they can get to a point of feeling justified, because there are some people that have this mindset that so long as things go well for me, that must mean that I'm doing the right thing. And I also think that this can, in a story, whether it's fantasy or not, because you mentioned this can be across genres, there are some individuals that think from almost like a divine place that if I'm succeeding, that must mean that I am on the right path because I would be punished otherwise, right? Thus, they keep going down a certain path, and if they keep succeeding in it, they keep thinking they're divinely inspired, or that they have basically divine permission or even approval. And so they're like, oh, I guess I have to keep doing this because obviously this is what this higher power must want. And I think exploring that kind of a villain can also be, one, really fascinating, because there are times that you can be like, yeah, this concept is applicable to certain situations, but also it can be a great villain to hate, where you're like, dude, no, stop, how do you not see this is bad? And it's just, but that's the other part of it too, is like, how would they get to a point when they think that they're backed by something all powerful? I think that can be really well done. Depends on how you do it, though. Next up, I like to know that villains were once good, watch them evolve into something darker, and then wonder if redemption is possible. If they cross into no redemption possible, then I love to hate them. I do want to expand on they were once good, but then they became darker, and say that I think something that works really well is when we ask the question, we either being the readers or somebody creating a story, ask the question, if the circumstances were slightly different, or if we were looking at the story through a different character's eyes, would this character actually be a hero? And I am going to reference the Cosmere. I'm not going to say specific character names, though, just because I don't want to spoil anything. But there is a character in Stormlight Archive who a lot of people hate once you get further into the story. You do see the motivations for why they're doing what they're doing, and a lot of those motivations and a lot of what they do as a result of their pain does quite strongly resemble a different character from Mistborn who is viewed as a hero. And so a lot of people ask the question, they do wonder, okay, does that actually mean that this hero in Mistborn, if we actually were following someone else, they would be the bad guy? And then you could reverse it, of course, and you can look at the person who's a villain, and then you can look at that Stormlight character and think, well, but if I truly think this other character is a hero, then that means I don't actually think this character's bad. And I do like when you kind of have that question mark of like, well, how do I feel? I love that. I love when you're like, I don't know. I will say another great way that I think people who create stories, whether they be authors or somebody who is a writer for a show or a video game, because there's great stories in video games as well, I think when they make the villain kind of funny. I definitely find there's a lot of characters that when you accomplish that, you kind of weirdly want them to come around to the hero side, because heroes sometimes can be very like by the books and boring, right? There's a reason that sometimes people, there's a, you know, a this or that, like hero or villain, and people will say villain, because I don't think it just comes down to like, I'm just trying to be edgy or anything like that. I think it's because sometimes the heroes are less interesting than the villains. And for all the reasons we've been talking about, we feel the need to give the villain motivations. We feel the need to have the reader ask like, oh, would I maybe be like that too if that was my situation? Whereas the heroes, sometimes it's like, well, they're like good, you know? And I think that's why the trend of morally gray has become more popular, because we're trying to do for heroes what we've done with villains. That said, though, again, if you can make the villain funny, I think that you can go along. Not that you need all villains to be funny, but I think that it can create a very weird feeling in a lot of people, especially because part of what can make villains funny is when they represent frustrations at systems that we as individuals feel in our day-to-day lives, where you're like, yeah, exactly, they get it. And when you start finding yourself doing that, like, I almost feel like I could sit with this person and rant about things with them. That's when I think it goes beyond just motivations. It goes into this, I have this kindred spirit. They understand me and I understand them. And I think that can be quite a bit of fun. As far as the redemption side of things go, I do like when somebody successfully makes you really hate a character, and then you're like, oh, they're never going to be redeemed. And then you're like, okay, maybe they did redeem them a little bit. I do like when you can create that. I think that's exceptionally difficult to do. However, I think part of what makes redemption arcs successful is if the villain themselves is craving some kind of redemption. It doesn't always need to be asking for forgiveness from the heroes or anything like that. It can just be this shift in them where they suddenly want to be different. Doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, now I want to be good, because that would require them to view themselves as evil before, which can work. Sometimes there are people that feel so guilty that they're like, I can't believe that's how I used to be. I don't want to be this anymore, and I really genuinely feel like I was bad and wrong. But a lot of times it's not that simple and it's not that stark. A lot of times it's, I don't think this is right anymore, but I don't know what's right. I just know I don't want to be this any longer. And so once they start resisting that, then that can lead to you also being like, oh, but they want to change. They are changing. And that can make villain deaths also so sad. Because when you're like, no, they were trying. They didn't want to do it anymore. They didn't want to be like that anymore. And then you hurt them. You're like, dang it. That's also a really great feeling. I do want to give a kind of little side note to this thought, though. I think sometimes, not that it can never be done well, but I think sometimes authors write the redemption of a villain simply by having them ultimately sacrifice themselves, and especially sacrifice themselves in some way for the heroes. Sometimes it feels like a cop-out. It feels a little lazy to just be like, well, they want to change, and I want you to feel bad when they ultimately die, so I'll have them have a change of heart right at the last minute, and then they'll sacrifice themselves, and you'll be like, oh no, and you're like, well, I mean, I might feel that for a second, but it's not going to linger with me as much as it would if you actually sort of earn that feeling of, no, they were so close, they tried so hard, they were ultimately trying their best. Next up, though, moving on, I agree about the villains with a motive, especially if we're talking about a whole race type of villain. Like White Walkers, okay, they come, winter comes, they turn everyone into Walking Dead. Then what? I think that this is difficult because some stories truly are about almost like forces of nature. Almost this feeling of this is inevitable. So if this is inevitable, how do we respond to it? And based off of how we respond to it, that can really open our eyes to the human existence and just how terrible people can be. It can be kind of boring though, as far as if you're looking at this force of nature as a villain. There's not a whole lot to dissect there. It's more of like the impacts that that force has can be more interesting. And that's totally fine if that's the story and if that's the purpose. Next up, Damon. A villain with a with a purse? No. A villain with a purpose/motive is always intriguing to me. Sorry, I just can't stop thinking about Because I actually said purse, I'm just thinking of like the Teletubby Tinky Winky with their little red bag. Villain with a purpose / motive is always intriguing to me. When there isn't a reason why they are the way they are, it's just boring. Whether they were wronged in the past or think they were, or tragic events slowly turned them evil, it's much more interesting when we know what made them go bad. I also like villains who hide in plain sight. Early on in the story, you think they're one of the good guys, but then a twist reveals who they really are. When it's done well, I always want to go back and see if it was foreshadowed and I either wasn't paying attention or just flat out didn't get it. And I especially like it when the reader finds out the villain is hiding in plain sight before the other characters do. They think she's one of them in the fight against the big bad. And I'm screaming at the page, stop working with her. Yeah, everything you're just describing. I'm like excited just thinking about it. I love that feeling of like, oh my gosh, are you serious? No. And to your point about foreshadowing, I do think that this is very difficult because you have to foreshadow enough that readers on either reread or when they sit and reflect on it, they're like, oh my gosh, wait, there were signs. I think that needs to be present. But if it's a little too heavy-handed, then it results in you thinking that the heroes just seem all really stupid. Because if you're like, dude, it's so obvious that this person is bad, how does nobody see it? And then when there's the big revelation and the character's like, what? You're like, yeah, no, duh. So I think you have to be really subtle, and I would say maybe lean more on the side of being really careful and really sneaky with that foreshadowing, because I think that the end result of either option going wrong, you're maybe not having enough hints, but they're there, at least allows for the reader to be like, okay, well, they were there. I don't think I'd ever have gotten it. I prefer if it was a little bit more present, but I can see how maybe it was there the whole time. Maybe it's not the most satisfying, but it doesn't leave you thinking that everybody in the book is a moron, because that I think is worse than the other scenario. Obviously, the right balance is what we're aiming for, but also the right balance is going to be dependent on one reader to the next, because some people are really good at predicting things and other people are so bad at it. And some people don't even try. So I think that I would encourage, I think, of course, don't take this as gospel, but I would encourage leaning on not giving away too much. Next up, Marta. What I find compelling is when the villain is calm, collected, hides in plain sight, there's another of those, and behaves in a calculated manner instead of being a rampaging, overpowered madman. When you listen to them talk and you think, that actually makes sense, I get it. I had that feeling after watching Joker with Joaquin Phoenix. I like it when their motive is not about grand taking over the world or being in power just for the sake of it, but a very specific, down-to-earth, targeted purpose. Yeah, I think that definitely taps into the feeling of things being more personal, and for us to certainly see ourselves. I think I touched on this before when I was talking about, like, can you imagine sitting beside that person and the two of you having common ground and sort of this like fist shaking at the system sort of feeling of like, yeah, exactly, this is what's wrong with the world. And it's just that maybe the villain is trying to actually do something about it, and you're like, oh, well, like, maybe don't do that though. But then you ask the question of like, but am I just a coward? Are they actually brave? And I like when you have those sorts of scenarios. I think that's really well done. Not the same Joker, but I do like the questions that arise from Christopher Nolan's Batman series where you're asking, I think the Joker certainly in that did some bad things. But there is a lot of debate about, okay, well, they actually ended up accomplishing the goals that Batman had. They actually accomplished them better than Batman did. It did mean that they resorted to some things that Batman wouldn't do, and they crossed lines that Batman wouldn't cross, but ultimately they were more successful. So also, does that make them a hero in the long run? Maybe. I like when you have those kinds of conversations that are able to be had as a result of how the story plays out. I find the best villains for me, this is Travis, are those who are either morally gray, relatable, or understandable. Mustache-twirling evil for the sake of being evil just feels really empty. The villains of Castlevania are masterpieces to me. When you are cheering for your heroes and villains, it's a wild ride with amazing payoffs. Okay, I am so glad that you mentioned, because I have wanted to mention some things with the characters in Castlevania. I do think there's something to be said of, depending on what you're focusing on, it's kind of like what I talked about when a character is funny. When you can ground somebody in, especially things to do with their most cherished people in their lives, when it's a child or a spouse and somebody they're really close to, I think so many of us, I mean, those are our people we love. Or a pet. Oh my gosh. If you want to make someone a villain, I know it's the lazy way out to make them hurt an animal, but I'm like, I will hate them and there is no redeeming. You make them just hurt animals for no reason. I'm like, yeah, evil. No, I don't care. No redemption for you. I can't get over it. But anyway, I digress. Point is, if you see something horrible happen to a character's child or to a character's spouse, and those people were totally innocent and they were mistreated and harmed, and then it results in the main character basically turning into almost like the rampaging madman, then there is almost this like, oh man, but they like really, I mean, it was their kid though. You know, like when it's that sort of feeling. And because we're talking specifically about Dracula, this is one of the best, I think, ways to, I'm not going to give spoilers because I don't want to, because for obvious reasons, I don't want to ruin the story for you guys. But when you have a character that is locked in so much, they almost don't even realize what they're doing, or they don't care because they're just that numb now. They have like nothing left to live for and stuff. I think that when they have that moment of realization of what have I done, it can be one of the most devastating things. And if you're not interested in Dracula, but you want to see a good example of this, I will have a video linked that has exactly what I'm talking about, where he has this moment of what have I done. Also, the voice acting in that show is so good. It's extremely violent. I just want to give a heads up for anybody that's now interested in checking out Castlevania, specifically the first Castlevania, not Castlevania Nocturne. They're two separate things. The first one occurs, and then Nocturne is chronologically, it comes later. But anyway, the first one is the one I'm talking about. But when that moment happens, it's pretty amazing how much you as the viewer are like, I mean, but they like feel bad. And it's so easy for you to just be like, I know that they're responsible for a lot of bad things, but also look how sad they are right now. And I think that, man, that is so difficult to pull off, but that scene is really, really well done. It's really good. And now I just kind of want to go watch Castlevania. Laura says, when it comes to villains, I definitely prefer those that over time you can come to understand their motivations and maybe even start to root for them. We've definitely touched on this, so agree. Sometimes villainy is even flipped on its head, and those you thought were the protagonists may not be after all. The Stormlight Archive has some amazing villains, both those who fit my description above as well as those who fall into villainy. Also agree. Blood Over Bright Haven by Emma Wong also has an excellent example of a protagonist that isn't as good as you are first led to believe. I just can't really enjoy stories with mustache-twirling villains with no more motivation than they desire death and destruction. Yeah, I think this is a nice way to kind of fully capture a lot of what we've been talking about. Also, I'm very excited to read Blood Over Bright Haven, and you're making me even more hyped for it. Now on to some from the community tab. First up, I think it's important for authors to remember that villains can just be bad guys. And I saw this one, I really wanted to make sure I got to it because it's not that it goes against what we've been talking about before, but it does provide a different angle to what we've been discussing. You can make a really dimensional villain without having to create an elaborate, sad backstory to make readers empathize or feel bad for these characters. And don't get me wrong, I love seeing in fiction what corrupts a person so much that they become the bad guy, but sometimes I just want to hate a villain character and not think about their sad parts, lol, or sad pasts. Their sad parts, I don't know what that would even be. Their sad pasts, lol. Especially when it feels like the narrative is using the villain's past as an excuse for their behavior. So great job, once again, identifying how that can be done in a way that is very uncomfortable for a lot of readers. But I do agree. I think that a great example of this, in a way that it's not that the antagonist in the story turns into a mustache twirling or anything like that, but a story that I reference quite often as I think showing abuse really well would be The Crane Husband. And in this story, if you haven't heard me talk about it, the setup is that you follow a teenage girl who has a little brother and a mother, and her mother one day brings home a giant crane, and it's essentially like, this is my new boyfriend, is the feeling you get. It's very strange because everything else feels so grounded in realism, but then that part is so bizarre, but it's not really treated like bizarre. It's not like, what the heck? That's a giant crane. It's not really written like that. If anything, the few glimpses our character has of the giant crane looking more like a man, it's almost like that's odd. But the reason I'm touching on this in reference to what you were saying, Mary, is that in this instance, I think that the focus of the story is to show the way that the abuse affects this teenage girl. By removing any form of personhood, you could say, from the abuser, it allows us to just focus on the effects. And we don't have the like, oh, but like, why are they doing this though? And what happened in their past? Like, I feel kind of bad for them. Like, that's not the point of that story. The point is, look at what harming children can do and how unsafe they feel and how it can disrupt every part of their life, from their school and education to their motivations, to their interests, and how much they then have to take on a parental role if they have younger siblings. If you're a younger sibling, are you even aware of what a quote-unquote normal childhood is supposed to look like? How does it affect you? What kind of relationship do you even have with your older sibling at this point? And I think that by removing the humanity from the antagonist in this scenario, it means the antagonist isn't necessarily interesting. But that's not the point in this scenario. And you can kind of hate, like, you just want them gone. And it places you in that perspective of the teenage girl, of just wanting that force to be out of the picture and how disruptive it was to their life. So completely agree. I know that's a more abstract example of what you're touching on. And sometimes it really can be as simple as, I just want to hate somebody in this story. And that can be satisfying. But I do think that there's a lot of different ways in which this can be done. That was the point. Ooh, I agree with this next one. Evelyn says, I love villains who create internal conflict within the hero by forcing them to break their moral principles or face a trauma from their past. I agree. I think that when the character is to a point, the hero in the story, or the protagonist, has to really cross a certain line, and once they've crossed into that certain line, there is that question of, is there ever any going back? But if also I'm justifying what I did and I feel like it's for the greater good, then does that mean I now understand why the person in front of me who is causing me to break my my principles, am I any better than them? Do I have any room to judge them or hate them? And I do like when there's those questions. I want a villain that's smart. I want a villain that I can't help but admire how intelligent they are. Even if they're morally questionable, I want my villain to bamboozle the heroes. I also do appreciate a smart villain. I think it's hard to bamboozle the heroes because that means you have to make both the villain and the hero smart for it to be satisfying. Because if the heroes are all really stupid, then it kind of makes it hard to root for them because you're like, really? This is the best and brightest going up against this mastermind? Because then if the heroes succeed at some point in getting rid of the villain or destroying whatever the case may be, then it doesn't feel earned because you're like, you're too dumb. There's no way you could have possibly circumnavigated whatever the plans were. But if they're both smart, the villain just happens to outsmart them frequently. Yes, completely agree. I love that too. If they have no redeeming qualities at all, they need to have something entertaining about them that makes me want to engage in their work. I do think this kind of a little bit relates to what I was saying before, where I'm like, you should try making them funny. Anyway, the Joker, another Joker shout out. The Joker, for example, is an absolute irredeemable villain. He's vile, but he's interesting and has a level of mystery that keeps me engaged despite his horrendous acts of depravity. His shtick makes me want to engage in stories about him. If your villain is pure evil, then they better be entertaining, otherwise I need to root for them in some way because they're doing wrong things for the right reasons. Loki, for example. Loki, L-O-K-I. Not like Loki, not like that. Anyway, yeah, completely agree. I think having something about them that you can't help but sort of want to lean in and learn more and understand them. I also think with series, you don't need to give everything right away. Having these glimpses where something seems to bother the villain a little bit more than usual, or having these moments where the villain gets mad when typically they're calm, and having these like, well, I saw that. What was that about? I kind of want to know. But you only give little hints here and there. It does build that curiosity of you're like, well, I kind of feel like there's more to them, though. I feel like there's more to them. And then when you do finally get the answers, you're like, oh. And it sort of makes you, similar to what some of you were talking about before about when they were the whole time bad, but you didn't know it. And then you can look back and be like, what? And your mind can be blown. I feel like something similar can be done in this scenario as well, where you're like, oh, there were hints the whole time. And then you see those scenarios where they were angry or where they did seem to have more of a reaction than usual. And you're like, oh, that means like they were holding so much in, like they could have flipped off the handle way more or something. Anyway, I don't know why I'm giving such annoying voices to everything today. Moving on. I like when stories have multiple villains with different moral codes, that some of the villains have lines they won't cross. I do want to interrupt for just a second to say, yes, I like when villains also have their own principles. I think that makes them far more interesting. Anyway, while others will do the most despicable things to achieve their goals, I think providing contrast between different villains can enhance the themes of the story, the conflicts with the heroes, and have also fun conflicts between various villains. Yes, I don't think we've touched on that just yet, but I think in talking about the full range previously, we were very much talking about how that connects to the heroes, which you touched on as well. But I don't think we've touched on just yet how different villains within the story can go against each other. And I do think that that can be a lot of fun. You do have to, I think, really develop it, though. I think this often works probably better when you have a series, because that gives you more time to develop. And then also, when you're not sure which villain you're rooting for, or when you're like, well, I mean, everybody, they're all bad, specifically referring to the villains, but there's one villain you're like, oh, but like, I don't want that one to die, though. That really then brings into question, are they that bad, though? Because if you're kind of rooting for one of them in this situation, maybe that means you find them more interesting than you realized. Next up, I don't need the villain to be relatable, but I need their reasons or reason for what they're doing to make sense. Yeah, I like how that's very simple, but to the point. This person says, charming and unhinged. Can't tell if they're morally corrupt. Yeah, I like that. Also short and to the point. They have to be a very interesting character first, regardless of moral alignment, for them to be a compelling villain. Alternatively, they can be hot. That also works. I almost am tempted to end here, because I feel like this is very full circle to something that we touched on almost at the beginning, that when they're hot, it does create some kind of different way of treating them when villains have pretty privilege. I love a villain you can really hate. It makes the payoff so much sweeter when they are finally defeated. Saying that, I also enjoy a villain that you can understand and is somewhat morally gray. I like how we can boil so much of what we're saying down to the fact of like, sometimes I love to hate characters. Sometimes I want to understand them, though. Even in a book medium, I firmly believe that a villain needs an iconic design or feature. This is a very specific thing, so I'm glad you brought it up. That makes them stand out visually. It makes readers latch onto them, and it can make a villain more frightening, more redeemable, more relatable, more uncanny, or anything you want your villain to be. Voldemort and his snake-like features come to mind easily. I actually think, even though it's not necessarily solely falling into villain, I think because I have watched Avatar: The Last Airbender this year, and I know a lot of you are very familiar with Avatar, having Zuko have specific features that make it so that people instantly are able to identify them, not just from Aang and gang's perspectives, but also on the other side, makes it so that you're also wondering, like, okay, well, if Zuko ever tries to resist, very easy to know what they look like. And then, I love Arcane. Silco's design is so fantastic. This next one says, I love an accidental villain. So when the villain just happens to cross the protagonist's path in a substantially negative way, prompting the protagonist to take action while the villain doesn't have a clue who they are or what they did to offend them. I really like this because this is really different from a lot of the rest of what we've discussed. Yeah, I don't find I see that very often, but I guess in a way I'm sort of thinking about a scenario where maybe it's higher stakes. So as an example, if there's somebody who is in a position of power and they just kind of have some casual order that they don't think twice about, but it has such serious consequences. I am going to mention Stormlight Archive again. There is a character who is kind of annoying for a long time, and then they also start to get to a point where you're like, oh, I kind of like them now. And that character is somebody who has power and has made certain decisions that you then see are kind of like the origin story of characters that start to go down darker paths. And that complexity is really interesting. And also that character who is somewhat annoying at first, then you start to like him a lot more. and then they don't even realize that they are an opposing force to this other character. That's the thing. It's exactly what you're describing. They have no idea. This, I think, works really well with characters that have power, and specifically characters that don't even think about how they're using that power. I think that can be done really well. I think it can be difficult to do as just like somebody accidentally like cut someone off in traffic and then a person like crash and they're like, I will get revenge on that person that cut me off or something like that. Like that's maybe less compelling. That was a really weird example. Can you tell that I have road rage? We'll go through one more, and it is very specific, and I completely agree. Sandra says, I hate it when the, quote, good guys do not check if the villain is actually dead or leave his death to landslides, etc., because killing him would make them look bad. And of course, who would have expected it? The villain shows up again for a final fight, killing many more whose deaths could have been prevented if only the good guys had made certain. Yes, absolutely. We've all learned, we have been burned too many times. We all know. Where's the body? Check for the body. Did you actually make sure that they're dead? Because yeah, for sure. And to add to what you're saying, it also is frustrating that it then is like this reveal when the character is not actually dead. And that reveal falls flat because you're like, well, yeah, nobody checked to make sure the body was there. But anyway, that's it for Two Writers from Readers Villains. This has been a lot of fun, and I do think at some point we'll talk about heroes, but the next From Readers video that we're going to be doing is actually about Goodreads, so it's going to be 2 Goodreads from readers. I'm looking forward to that one. And then I think we're going to do a bonus one, because typically I do about 1 a month, and I'm kind of thinking it would be fun to do a bonus video that's 2 fandoms from readers. So if you are interested in leaving some responses for that, just be on the lookout. That won't be posted yet because the next one is going to be the Goodreads one, but it will eventually pop up over on both the community tab and on Patreon. And once again, if you want to guarantee that your response gets read, I do always go through the patron responses. But anyway, thanks so much to everybody who participated. I will have the post itself linked in the description bar in case you yourself would like to reference that post and look through people's responses. I really appreciate, though, everybody who engages in this. I think it's a lot of fun, and I really love getting to see your thoughts on things. Have a great rest of your day, though, and I'll see you later. Bye.